Today, I'm reviewing a recently released accident analysis from Pilot Debrief. Before we start, I want to acknowledge Hoover and the work he's done to advance aviation safety. His channel has helped a lot of pilots think more critically about risk, and I respect that mission. Anytime we review an accident, it's important to remember that real people and real families are involved. The purpose of this discussion is not to second guess from the comfort of hindsight, but to extract lessons that make us safer pilots. Hoover always does this very well. This particular case involves an IFR departure at night after a night out in Las Vegas. That combination alone introduces a number of human factor variables that are worth exploring and caught my attention. This also hits home because I just completed a similar night flight to Las Vegas, and we made a different decision with a different outcome on our departure. As a physician, pilot, and aviation medical examiner, I'm especially interested in what happens to decision-making under fatigue, possible alcohol or medication exposure, circadian disruption, and high workload IFR conditions. We're going to walk through the timeline briefly, and then I'll pause along the way to talk about the physiological and cognitive traps that can quietly stack risk. My hope today is to add value from this lens to the good work of Pilot Debrief. The goal is simple. If this discussion causes any of us to reassess a marginal go decision in the future, then it has served its purpose. I'm watching this video for the first time along with you. Let's take a look.
This was all that was left of the wreckage after a private jet crashed just 800 feet short of the runway in California, killing both pilots and all 4 passengers on board. However, I think the worst part...
I'm going to pause right here. We don't hear of a lot of jet crashes in general aviation. Certainly anytime a plane crashes, particularly a jet, it does make the headlines. But jets are generally known in the aviation community as safer option than your single-engine pistons. The engines cost a heck of a lot more. They undergo a very detailed maintenance program if you're following the rules, and they're just built with higher reliability. So we don't tend to see as many engine failures in jet aircraft. However, if you've been following aviation crashes for some time, we realize that most of these events actually happen due to pilot error. Let's keep going.
Part about the story is the families that were torn apart simply because of the decisions that were made that caused this deadly tragedy, which is why we need to talk about what really happened. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on the evening of July 7th, 2023, when 2 pilots and 4 passengers boarded a private jet at the French Valley Airport in Murrieta, California, for what was supposed to be a quick trip to Las Vegas for a night out in Sin City. Reese was 25 years old, and he was the pilot sitting in the left seat at the time of the crash. According to the investigation, Reese had a commercial pilot certificate with single and multi-engine ratings, as well as an instrument rating, and at the time of the crash, he had about 950 hours of total flight time.
So I'm just going to pause there. Reese had a good number of flight hours, and that's significantly more hours than I have at this point in my flying career at about 600. But it's important to realize that no matter how many hours you have, you're still human, and human factors can influence the outcome of your decisions. And so I'd be curious to see where this flight goes. The age doesn't really play a whole lot in here. We could be just as concerned about a 25-year-old as a 75-year-old, and maybe the concern would actually be flipped. So the age doesn't concern me. He's in the right age group to have that number of hours for somebody that's committed early to flying. He's got the appropriate certificates and ratings. I love that he's instrument rating. I didn't hear anything about his medical certification class, and I didn't hear anything about type ratings. Maybe more to come.
Was 32 years old, and he was the pilot sitting in the right seat for the flight. And just like Reese, he also had a commercial pilot certificate with ratings for single and multi-engine aircraft, but he also had a helicopter rating, and he was a certified flight instructor. At the time of the...
Always sad to see that a certified flight instructor goes down with their airplane. CFIs, in my experience, tend to be a bit more conservative. They assess their risk, and they know that there are true risks in flying. You know, when you look at your airline transport pilots, all of those guys, well, for the most part, spent some time as flight instructors, building up their hours and honing some of their skills. Not sure if that plays a role here, but I also noted that it wasn't a CFII. So one thing that we might look at is, was this instructor certified to teach instruments?
crash, Manny had about 1,600 hours of total flight time, which was significantly more than Reese. Unfortunately, the NTSB didn't provide any further details about either pilot regarding their flight training history or how many hours they had on the type of aircraft they were flying. There was also no evidence that the NTSB interviewed any other pilots that might have flown with them to better understand some of the factors involved in this tragedy. That being said, it's also not clear who was flying the plane at the time of the crash. But the one thing that we do know for certain is that the passengers trusted these two men to keep them safe. In fact, sitting in the back of the plane was Manny's wife.
Hoover's usually pretty committed to that concept that we as pilots are entrusted to make appropriate go, no-go decisions. And in my household and with my colleagues, if I'm concerned about weather or if I need to get us a little earlier out of a community due to incoming weather or conditions, they tend to defer that decision to me. And if they don't, it ends up that we don't go if the risks stack up against us. There is always another day, and it's just not worth it. So good on Hoover to point this out. We all take that responsibility, hopefully, very seriously, and we need to remind ourselves that it's not just our lives, and our risk tolerance may be different than some of our passengers. This is very common in medical decisions. I may think that one treatment option is appropriate, but my patient may value things a little differently, and they may assess the risk and benefits and alternatives in a different way. And so we need to err on the side of conservatism and caution.
Abigail, who is 33 years old, and together they leave behind 5 children. Reese's girlfriend Lindsay, who is 31 years old, was also on board the plane, and the other 2 passengers were Abe and Alma, a husband and wife who together had 7 children waiting for them back home. Tragically, what should
Man, did you hear those number of children? That is incredible. And these parents who probably worked so hard every day raising their family and working and contributing were probably ecstatic just to get a few hours. But you know what? That also tells me there may have been some pressures to get home and be with their kids and their other family members. And I wonder if that influenced their decision to not stay the night.
It had been a fun evening, turned out to be a deadly disaster, and my heart goes out to the children that lost their parents, as well as the friends and family members of the victims. Now, in order to better understand how this all happened, we need to start by talking about what the plan was for the flight. In order to give you some context, I've sat through probably over 1,000 debriefs when I was a fighter pilot, and one of the things that always stuck out to me was that a lot of times the reason why the mission failed was because there was something wrong with the plan. And I'd argue that the same can be said when it comes to general aviation mishaps. Now, in this situation, the plan was to fly to Vegas for a night on the town and then fly back home in the early morning hours. And what we know is that everyone showed up at the French Valley Airport and took off just after 9 p.m. local time to begin the trip. The flight to Las Vegas took less than an hour, and according to eyewitnesses, when they arrived in Vegas, a limo driver picked up the pilots and passengers for what was supposed to be a night on the town, and then about 6 hours later, they hopped in the plane around 3 a.m. local time to begin the flight.
So right away, that is likely going to contribute. We don't want to bias our evaluation, but I personally would not fly out at 3 a.m. after a night on the town, and I agree with Hoover that the planning phase here may have stacked up risk against our victims here. So just think about this. Are you normally awake at 3 a.m.? Can you take on life safety critical events at that time of night? Typically, our circadian rhythms are putting us into a less alert, less able state at this time. We're generally supposed to be sleeping. So unless you have reversed your circadian rhythm and this is a normal activity for you, we have a higher risk here of cognitive overload and poor decision making.
Back home. When it comes to the plan, there are a few really important things that we need to talk about. First of all, we don't know if either pilot had any recent experience flying at night, which is definitely going to present a different set of challenges compared to flying during the daytime.
You know, one of my instructors said night flying is instrument flying. And if you've ever flown night, you know what we're talking about here. I'm so thankful that I have several pieces of tools that help me to fly more safely at night. One of them is humility and knowing that this is a higher risk situation and that I should treat it as if I was flying instrument instruments, even if on a VFR plan, which means I should be looking at departure procedures, minimum climb rates, calculating my performance, etc. Don't forget to do those things. It's easy to forego those once you have some experience under your belt, but if you want to make it easier to do that, simply add this tool into your subscription, such as ForeFlight. They have performance add-on options that you can calculate your takeoff distance, your climb rates, your climb distances, etc. And I think those tools can all help. We also have synthetic vision in our Cirrus airplane, which helps me to get a better lay of the land. And then we have a camera that looks for infrared on the plane wing. I don't really find that to be very helpful. I think the synthetic vision is worth more. But night flying is instrument flying.
More importantly, though, we have no idea how long the pilots were awake before they started the flight, so I think that fatigue definitely could have played a role in what happened, and what's frustrating is that the NTSB only briefly mentioned this in their final report. In fact, studies show that if you wake up at 9 a.m. and have been awake for 18 hours, then at 3 a.m. your performance level is only about 65%, which is the equivalent of having a blood alcohol content level of 0.05%, which means it's probably not a good idea to try and fly an airplane. Now,
as expected, Hoover is just an absolute pro. Great discussion of the circadian rhythm and the data. And then I think it's awesome for us to think about that in the context of alcohol. We wouldn't drink and fly, and if you are one that does, you shouldn't be piloting. We don't want you in the community, that's for sure. But you would not do that. And so would I drink to a 0.08 and then go fly? No, because I know that it's going to affect my judgment, my reflexes, my inhibition will be greater, and I'll be taking on more risk. It's just not worth it. So treat sleep the same way. If you are sleep deprived, essentially you're flying drunk. And you know that, right? If you drive a car and you are too tired to safely drive, you're driving impaired.
Now, in full transparency, the NTSB didn't provide any witness interviews, so we don't have any idea how long Manny and Reese had been awake prior to the flight. But either way, this is the kind of stuff that pilots need to think about before they go fly, especially if there's a good chance that your passengers are your friends and family members, and you know they want to get back home, because that's...
I'm going to toss this in there too. We also don't know, so far in the video, if there were any substances used. Some of us pilots and professionals in other fields will depend on things like caffeine to help improve our alertness. And that can be helpful, but there is a limit. The FAA actually has a limit of 1,000 milligrams in a 24-hour period, but I can tell you, medically speaking, unless you're adapted to that, that does pose some additional risks, such as tremor, anxiety, palpitations and tachycardia, diaphoresis. It can drive your blood pressure up, and it can make you more likely to have a panic attack, so your emotional stability may not be as good either. And so just be conscientious if you think you can outpower your fatigue with medications.
Only going to increase the pressure on you to make the flight happen. That being said, the aircraft that Reese and Manny were flying was a 1979 Cessna 550 Citation II. And if you're not familiar, this is a light business jet known for its reliability, cost effectiveness, and the ability to operate from shorter runways. According to the investigation, the aircraft had over 14,000 hours of total flight time, and it had just completed an annual inspection on June 30th, only 8 days before the crash. The aircraft was equipped with a Garmin GTN 750 that could display the weather, instrument approach procedures, and other key details on a moving map for the pilots to reference.
I actually have experience with the GTN 750. I think it's a fantastic piece of equipment for your aircraft. I had this in a Cirrus SR22 G6. It was the first airplane that I'd purchased, and it's a touchscreen option. It can integrate audio panel into it. It can control your radios and nav, GPS, like Hoover said, moving map. It can be great for situation awareness, and it does some things a little bit better than some of the newer Garmin products. Like, for example, the Garmin G1000, that particularly in the Cirrus Perspective Plus we fly now, one differentiator there is the GTN 750 will tell me the ground speed of traffic that is near me, and the newer version, like G1000 on the Cirrus Perspective Plus, does not. I can still get the tail number of that traffic, but it's really helpful actually to see the ground speed references. So I've used that in the past to determine who's going to make it to an airport first and whether I should fall in behind or keep ahead, and just helps with situation awareness. But it's a good piece of equipment, and you can certainly fly safely with it when you're trained and know how to use it.
referenced during the flight. The reason why this matters is because even though the aircraft didn't have a flight data recorder, that Garmin device recorded all of the key data that the investigators needed to understand what happened during the final moments of the flight. However, one of the most important things that you need to know about this aircraft is that even though it can be operated with just one pilot, you've got to meet certain requirements in order to do so. Now, in this case, Manny and Reese both had a type rating on this aircraft, but they also both had a limitation on that rating requiring them to have a second pilot that was also qualified on the aircraft to fly with them. What that means is that they were perfectly legal to fly together, but again, it's not clear how much experience either one of them had on the aircraft. However, what we do know is that they definitely had all the tools they needed to conduct the flight, and the NTSB determined that there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft. Before we get to the next part, I want to take a minute to explain something that most people never realize until they look themselves up online. Now, if you've ever searched your name and been surprised by how much information is already out there, like your address, your age, or even... Now let's get back to the video. Manny, Reese, and the passenger showed up at the Las Vegas airport just before 3 a.m. local time to get ready for the flight home. This is where it's important to understand that the French Valley Airport has an automated weather observing system known as AWOS, but there's no weather forecast capability for the airfield. And around the time that the pilots were taking off from Las Vegas, the French Valley Airport was reporting clear skies with 10 miles visibility. Now that's probably why there's no evidence that Reese requested a formal weather briefing or looked at any weather imagery through his ForeFlight account. And my guess is that he and Manny probably assumed that this would be a nice, easy flight. According to the GPS data, after they...
I'll just say there, it's actually too easy in ForeFlight not to check a briefing, a formal one. I wish it would be a required step, maybe when you file, although sometimes you do file in advance and would have to go back and check your briefing. But there should be some additional alert system that says, hey, you need to brief this. That's only relevant really if you're filing the plans, and who knows at this point, I'm not sure. I mean, right now on the screen we see 19,000, and so that means they would have had to file the flight plan. But, it's sometimes easy just to assume, oh yeah, everything's clear, skies are good, I don't need to worry about weather. And you can even use in the profile view of ForeFlight to see if there's clouds, icing, turbulence, TFRs, things like that. And so we can become a little bit too accustomed to the ease of that and not actually conduct a formal briefing. So I always hear that with a little bit of an asterisk, like we don't know what they actually reference. We know that they didn't do a full briefing maybe in ForeFlight, but were they checking various other data sources? Did they use a different app such as Windy to review weather data using very similar sources as you might find in ForeFlight, but doesn't record it as a formal briefing?
After they got airborne, they climbed to about 19,000 feet, and because it was a short flight, they only had about 12 minutes at their cruising altitude before they started descending for the approach. Keep in mind, at the time they started their descent, the French Valley Airport was still reporting clear skies with 10 miles visibility, and I want you to hear what happened next.
And approach station 19 Kilo Romeo, like cancel IFR, we're 17-3 descending.
Citation 819 Kilo Romeo, SoCal, altimeter 2984, understand cancel IFR?
2984, yes, we're canceling IFR, 819 Kilo Romeo.
So nothing unusual there. Oftentimes in these uncontrolled airports, you actually want to cancel sooner rather than later because there's no tower to work with, and often ATC can't let departing traffic leave if you're too close to the airport on an approach. And so it does help with traffic management to get off of your flight plan, your IFR flight plan, and go visual, but you still have to meet the VFR flight rules in that situation. Let's see what happens.
9 Kilo Romeo, roger, cancellation. IFR is received. VFR altitude routing your discretion. No weather or landing information for French Valley.
My discretion, I got the weather and landing at French Valley, 819 Kilo Romeo.
So, that's always a little bit sketchy when I hear no information. And, if you were going into a small mountain airport, that would probably be something I wouldn't want to do in my Cirrus. I mean, if you're one of these STOL pilots that has, a 25-foot landing distance, you maybe would be more comfortable. Probably not at night in this situation, but, I fly into a small airport pretty routinely that's about 3,000 feet long, and I don't take any chances on that airport. If there's any tailwind, I'm going to go the other direction, even if it's not preferred by noise abatement procedures, because I want a little bit more safety factor there for me. So at night, no weather, But I don't know how long this runway is and how much this jet needs. So hopefully they'd calculate their performance requirements and have some safety margin that they'll consider. And you could always do a lower pass and look for a windsock. I don't know how many times pilots in jet aircraft do that, but certainly in the slower pistons, that's not uncommon.
All right, so what's happening is that they've started their descent, and it sounds like Reese is the one talking on the radio, and he's canceling IFR. Now that means they can point the aircraft where they need to go, and the controller isn't going to give them altitudes or headings to fly. However, the controller was obligated to tell them that he didn't have the weather or landing information for French Valley, and that's why Reese replied saying that he had the weather. The only problem was that the weather had changed. In fact, between 3:35 and 3:55, it went from clear skies to overcast at 300 feet with mist and 3/4 of a mile visibility because a large fog bank had rolled into the area. Think about that. In just 20 minutes, the weather had gotten drastically worse. And I think what happened is that after Reese canceled IFR, he got an update on the weather, and that's why he got back on the radio and listened to what he said.
Approach, station A1 Kilo Romeo, we just got the updated weather. Looks like we can out to the R now.
9 Kilo Romeo, understand you're looking for an IFR pickup for French Valley?
Hey, firm A1 Kilo Romeo.
9 Kilo Romeo, clear to French Valley via drag TIGMU. Descend maintain 6,000.
So good on these pilots. We need to recognize that they did the right thing. They got back with ATC. They changed the plan. They wanted to fly an instrument approach. They could have illegally just entered the instrument approach on their own decision-making and flown it all the way in, but that would not have been appropriate. You needed to get back with air traffic control, get clearance, and get put on the approach. And so I'm glad they did that. That's the right move. Hopefully they've studied this approach and they aren't too far behind the curve on that, but that's what I'm thinking. Are we behind the curve on this? I don't know how far that first waypoint is from their current position, what altitude variation would be required to get there in a safe manner per that approach. So all those things are going in my head. And, if you need more time, you can ask for delay vectors with air traffic control or ask to be put into a hold and reset.
6,000, 819 Kilo Romeo.
At this point, Reese is asking to pick up an IFR clearance again, meaning that he needs the controller because they want to fly the RNAV GPS approach to runway 18, and the controller cleared them direct to TICMU, which is one of the initial approach fixes on the approach.
I'm just noticing the LPV here has a 7/8 statute mile visibility, and I thought we just heard that there was 3/4, so that may present a problem here for these folks.
However, it's worth pointing out that the lowest they can fly on this approach is down to 1,600 feet, which is only about 250 feet above the ground, and that requires at least 7/8 of a mile visibility, which if you remember from earlier, the weather was 300-foot overcast and 3/4.
Okay, good. My memory is not failing me. That little detail maybe is the difference between having a good outcome and not, but this is where you might ask to be put in a hold. With the weather changing that quickly, it could have opened up, in another 20 minutes and or potentially worsened. And so I doubt there was an alternate filed on this plan. If they didn't go through the process of briefing it, they may not have filed an alternate. I don't know. And but it's reasonable that you consider your alternates even if good weather occurs at your planned departure, because you never know, by the time you get to your destination, things will have changed. So remember, going back to the steward of these passengers' safety, always have a backup plan.
1/4 of a mile visibility. Now, basically what all that means is even though they might have been legal to try the approach, it was going to be extremely challenging. And at this point, they only had about 20 minutes left to live.
Interesting. So, I can't tell the difference between 3/4 and 7/8 statute mile visibility. So, I would not have attempted that. At 250 feet and 3/4 statute mile visibility, if you guys have flown that, I have never flown that tight of an approach except in the simulator. You come out right on top of the runway, and you can't see that far down the runway. Usually the ones I'm practicing on have these runways longer than a mile, and so I wouldn't even be able to see the end of the runway, and you come out really right on top of them. And that's if you are able to do the LPV. If something goes wrong with autopilot or GPS, you may have to step down to one of the other approaches.
It's important to know that what Reese and Manny were trying to do was fly the approach using the LPV minimums because that gets them down as low as possible to hopefully get below the weather. And if you're not familiar, LPV stands for Localizer Performance with Vertical Guidance. And even though technically it's not a precision approach, it still provides you with lateral and vertical guidance similar to an ILS, and it even has a decision altitude. The reason why that matters is because when you're flying an LPV approach, you're following that vertical guidance all the way down to that decision altitude. And if you don't see the runway environment, then you have to go around. There's no leveling off and looking around hoping that you're going to find the runway. That being said, according to the GPS...
The other thing I'll throw in here is, as an aviation medical examiner, I talk to pilots just about every day that I see patients. And most, I don't think, are actually instrument current. There are rules on what you need to do, right? There's the 6 approaches within a 6-month period, but there's nuance to that, right? You need to fly down in true instrument conditions to the final approach fix, or if you're simulating it, down to minimums. And so many of my pilot friends and patients tell me that they haven't really met that criteria, but they kind of ignore that. And even to the point of some saying, well, I would never fly if it was that low on the weather. But look at what happens. I mean, this is a great example of when things change quickly, and you may be in the air with this pressure to get home and land, and you may not have done an instrument approach to minimums since you trained 10 years ago when you got your rating. So it's really important that we follow our requirements for currency, and more importantly, to be proficient. So if you're going to risk flying in weather, we need to practice to the worst weather and be prepared for doing a go-around, for getting into holds and waiting weather out. We need to have enough fuel minimums. We need to know what our performance calculations are, and we need to have alternates. That's just my opinion as an aviation examiner, medical examiner, and a pilot who has been in these situations having to decide whether this is appropriate or safe for me to do or not. And I hope you'll be making decisions based on safety as well.
Data, everything was looking pretty good during the approach, and they got down as low as about 1,620 feet MSL, which is about 20 feet above their decision altitude. But then instead of performing a go-around, they kind of started a shallow climb, gaining about 80 to 100 feet, and then they offset to the left.
Man, this offset to left, I'd have to go back to the approach plate and see what the true missed approach plate states, but it makes me think of the orthopedic surgeon who tragically died in a plane crash up near Steamboat Springs, who came to the missed approach point and did not fly straight out, started immediately turning to the left, and ended up impacting terrain. So I'd be curious to know what the actual missed approach was supposed to be, because this is very dangerous, not following it exactly. They're designed to keep you safe, but you have to follow it.
But then they started descending again for a brief moment before finally performing the go-around. Now, honestly, what this looks like to me is a situation where they got down to their minimums and they didn't see the runway.
All this turning ups and down, now we start thinking about spatial disorientation. Are they starting to have a difficult time keeping awareness of where they're at in space, where they're pointed, what angles, rolls, etc.? And if you're in the clouds, you just cannot tell based on body sensations. Your body will lie to you, and you have to be laser focused on what those instruments are telling you and fly the instruments and not feel, listen to your typical vestibular systems, your pressure sense, etc. Fly the instruments. Really critical in this phase of flight. This would be potentially very disorienting.
So they started driving ahead, trying to find a hole to drop down below the weather, but it just wasn't working. Now, thankfully, they made the right decision to go around, but now they've got a tougher choice to make. Do you divert somewhere else, not knowing what the weather is at the nearby airports? Or do you hold and hope that the fog burns off? Or do you try to do another approach? Listen to what Reese said.
Citation 819 Kilo Romeo, you trying to call?
Yeah, I missed that over Charlie.
Kilo Romeo, Roger, same intentions.
I'm going to try it one more time for you when I go up.
So, I'm a lower time pilot than these two pilots, But I like to state on the radio that, this is who I am, and I am on the published MIST, and I follow the rules of that published MIST until told otherwise by ATC. That, to me, also is a reinforcement that I need to fly the published MIST and not make it up myself.
The reason why the controller is asking them to state their intentions is because the controller can't tell them what to do. The controller doesn't know what their qualifications are, how much fuel they have, what the aircraft is capable of, or what their plans are. Now, in this case, Reese said that they wanted to try the approach one more time, but I'd argue this would have been the perfect time to tell the controller that the weather at French Valley was right at the minimums, and ask the controller what the weather is doing at some of the nearby airports. At least that way they could have started to evaluate some of the other options. And in all fairness, I know...
Yeah, that's absolutely great advice. I mean, there are friends, there are... in a way, our co-pilots in the sky. I mean, air traffic control is amazing, great people that really are trying to do a great job every day by keeping us safe and flying appropriately. So I'll tell you, an example, I was looking at our ADS-B weather data in the Cirrus, and it painted this precip all the way from the eastern section of Colorado all the way to the western section. And ATC had diverted us down south from the Centennial Airport down towards Pueblo to try and make it back towards the southwest part of the state instead of going in a direct path. And they did that because there was weather buildup just west of the Denver area. And I remember at one point they asked me if I wanted to start turning westbound. And I asked them if they saw precip, and they said on their radar they did not see it. So I had some ADS-B data that was either delayed or just erroneous. And so ATC likely will have more up-to-date information. Potentially, if you have an aircraft that has onboard radar, you'll have some additional visibility of weather that I may not have in the Cirrus. But ATC is going to have a larger viewpoint and perspective, and so ask for help. That's what they're there for.
I know I keep mentioning Reese because he's the one talking on the radio and he's the one sitting in the left seat, but the truth is that we don't know if he was the one flying the plane. Manny could have been flying the plane from the right seat, and Reese was just the one handling the radios.
Yeah, and in talking with instructors, they fly so many hours in the right seat. Often they become more comfortable flying PIC in the right seat. So very possible that Manny was pilot in command.
Unfortunately, even though the aircraft had a cockpit voice recorder, it didn't record anything for this flight. So there's no way to tell who was behind the controls, and we'll never know what was said between the two pilots during the approach. All we know for certain is that they were going to try to land one more time. As Reese and Manny got set up for the second approach, the visibility at the airfield decreased to only a half mile due to the fog. According to the data recovered from the Garmin device, their airspeed during most of the final approach was 130 knots, which was at least 30 knots faster than the landing reference speed they should have flown based on their weight and configuration. However,
I don't know exactly what's going on with them, but I can tell you for myself that when you're kind of in this high energy situation, you got a lot of stuff going on, maybe also you're tired and fatigued because it's almost 4 a.m. I've been there where, that one little detail of speed starts to not be on the top of your mind. And it may show that we're starting to get behind the airplane at this point. So something to keep an eye on.
However, as a quick side note, they were also doing about 130 knots during the first approach. So it seemed like...
Okay, good pickup by Hoover, as expected. The guy's awesome. And maybe they just come in fast. That may just be their standard. But remember what happened on the first one. He was also surprised, right? They went visual. They were going to try and land. And then, oh boy, there's bad weather and had to get back on an approach. So it may have been that they were behind the plane a little bit on the first flight. The first attempt of landing, but here we are a little bit fast.
Both pilots were behind the airplane, and this was a very dangerous situation. That's because not only was the weather bad, but the NTSB discovered that the approach end of runway 18 was completely dark without any approach lighting system or other cultural lighting present. And this created what's sometimes referred to as a black hole approach, where the runway lights might be your only source of light. Now, this can be very disorienting and lead to pilots getting too low on the approach or landing short of the runway. In this case, what they discovered was that even though the airplane's rate of descent was fairly stable, around 750 feet per minute for most of the final segment of the approach, about 5 seconds before the recording ended, the aircraft nosed over to a descent rate of about 2,300 feet per minute, possibly in an attempt to duck under the fog. 5 seconds later, the aircraft crashed into the ground about 800 feet short of the runway, ultimately killing everyone on board.
800 feet short of the runway. How tragic. And, I wonder what autopilot they have in their plane. This is something that I train to, taking autopilot down to minimums and really seeing what its true capabilities are. And you can do that in the simulator. You can do that in the real plane. You can go with an instructor, a second pilot as a safety pilot. But knowing your equipment to that level and seeing how accurate or inaccurate it is in the different approach modes, I think is really critical. It seems to me like they disconnected autopilot, and as Hoover said, potentially were trying to dip under the fog, or maybe they just weren't trimmed well, and when they popped off autopilot, things changed quickly, and they were already a little bit behind. I don't know.
However, one of the most shocking parts of this investigation was that Manny's ethanol levels were high, and it was likely...
Okay. Well, that's absolutely tragic to hear. Gosh, that hits hard. We don't know if he was the pilot. So there was some alcohol involved. I hope he wasn't piloting. But you know what that also means is that Reese shouldn't have been flying, because remember, he needed a co-pilot. And so if your colleague is consuming alcohol, they are not fit for flight. And whether they're the PIC or the co-pilot second in command, they can't act in those ways. They cannot have alcohol in their system. The FAA regs on this one say 8 hours bottle to throttle and sober. And so it doesn't say 0.00, it says sober. So these levels being high, I wonder how high, and I wonder if he had followed the 8-hour rule, and I wonder if he would say that he was sober. I don't know. Let's see what else we can hear from this.
That he had consumed alcohol at some point during the evening, even though the investigation couldn't conclusively determine.
Okay, so if we say during the evening, they probably didn't meet the 8-hour rule, for one, right? Let's see what else.
Determine his blood alcohol level, his impairment may have limited his ability to make a positive contribution to the safety of the flight. The NTSB determined that the probable cause of the crash was the flight crew's decision to descend below the decision altitude of the approach without having the runway visual reference they needed, which resulted in controlled flight.
Which so tragically means it was avoidable. Didn't need to happen. It shouldn't happen to you or your friends or family. Please, we don't want to lose any more pilots or any passengers. I mean, it's a tight-knit community, and we all need to be at the top of our game to do this. It's an absolute privilege to be able to fly. You all know that. Let's keep it that way.
Flight into terrain. However, I'd argue that the root cause of this tragedy goes all the way back to their plan to make an all-night trip to Vegas and back, probably assuming that the weather would be good and that nothing bad was going to happen. Tragically, in this case, the flight turned into a deadly disaster when all the margins disappeared and 6 people died as a result. And the children, families, and loved ones they left behind will never be the same. But my hope is that this video helps prevent something like this from happening in the future. And if you learned something, then be sure to check out another debrief on the channel, and thanks for your support.
Thanks again, Hoover, for another great pilot debrief. You are an absolute animal. You're doing a great job here. Almost 1 million subscribers, I think, at this point. So well done, and thank you for your contributions to the community. And if you've made it this far, I really appreciate you staying with us as well. And I hope that my commentary added some value. If it did, please give me a like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you'd be interested in learning more about medical topics related to aviation that I might be able to shed some light on, or federal regulations related to different medical topics. One thing that's always interesting to me is the do not issue, do not fly med list. I'd encourage you guys to look at that list. It's actually pretty short, has some good ground rules for medications to avoid and flying. And a lot of these are over the counter. We may not even know that that medication is sedating and can hurt our flying abilities. But check out the list, become more informed, train, and let's keep each other safe and accountable out there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. If you own a Cirrus and want to unlock where it can truly take you, training matters. At Montrose Aviation, we work with Cirrus pilots to build mountain proficiency, emergency preparedness, and confidence through structured simulator and flight training. Bring your instructor, train with one of ours, or even include your spouse for parachute and emergency scenario training. Visit montrose-aviation.com to learn more.